This video focuses on Piggy in Chapter 1 of Lord of the Flies. Piggy is singled out by Golding as a natural victim, but he is also one of the people that we should most respect. As with Ralph, the main technique Golding uses is that of contrast. Although he will appear to be a good person, the first description is a contrast comparing his cry, his own voice, to the witch-like cry of the bird. Immediately, Golding gives us a presentation of him that links him to evil. In contrast to that, the first thing we notice about him is how friendly he is. "Hi," it said. "Wait a minute." But we notice the word "it" here, and the fact that the boy is not mentioned, it's just his cry. It seems from the outset that Piggy, as a person, is very easy to ignore. Nobody cares who he actually is. Golding is writing at a very class-conscious time, and he deliberately gives a very working-class accent and dialect to Piggy. So instead of him saying, "I can hardly move," he says, "I can't hardly move," immediately distancing himself from the other middle-class boys that we shall meet. Instead of simply describing him as wearing a windbreaker, Golding makes sure that it's greasy, and he kind of encourages us as readers to look down on him in a way that the boys on the island also will. And then something surprising happens. Golding focuses on his nakedness, his vulnerability, and then the crooks of his knees were plump. He's a kind of delicate creature, one that we should sympathise with. And there begins to be a sort of biblical language here. Nakedness reminds us of innocence, the crook, the shepherd's crook, and of course Jesus is the leader of the flock, the shepherd. And then we're reminded of Jesus's crown of thorns that he wears on the cross before he dies. These thorns torment Piggy, and he picks them out. But they also work symbolically to link him to the sufferings of Jesus. Other ways in which he suffers are the sheer ill fortune of his physical state. It is not his fault that he is shorter than Ralph, but it is something which makes him distinctive to the other boys and easier to dismiss. It may be his fault that he's very fat, and certainly the other boys will look down on him for it. And then finally, to disable this boy further, Golding has decided to give him spectacles. Not just any spectacles, but thick ones. And of course, thick also implies stupid. Golding will be quick to show that Piggy is actually very intelligent, but this word thick allows us to imagine how the other boys see him. In contrast to Ralph, we also see that Piggy actually cares about the other children, all them other kids, he says. His intelligence is soon revealed when he has to explain to Ralph how they have come to crash land on the island. But his exclamation is not grammatically correct. "We was attacked." This again is working class dialect, so that Ralph can easily dismiss him with, "His father will still be back." "When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows. I saw the other part of the plane." Now I've read it that way so that you can see the apparent stupidity in the way that he speaks. However, if we look at what is actually said, this is when their own plane looks like it's going to be shot down. Piggy has had the presence of mind to see what else is going on. He's looked out of the window. He hasn't sat down in fright, and he's watched the other plane and realised the implications of those flames. The pilot that has ejected them has also been shot down. Piggy's concern for the other kids is simply ignored by Ralph, however, and it seems that his feelings for other boys make him very unusual. The fat boy waited to be asked his name in turn. Perhaps this is Golding looking at the class system. Piggy is used to waiting his turn. He knows his place. And we might imagine that Golding might be critical of this class system. The other thing he does with Piggy is associate him with females. My auntie told me not to run, and Piggy's auntie is virtually the only female character mentioned in the novel. Women are simply dismissed in this novel, which might make you think that Golding is writing a criticism not just of mankind, but specifically of men. And then the next thing Golding does is add yet another disability. He gives Piggy asthma. We might decide that Piggy represents all those less fortunate who are made victims by society. However, Golding is also slightly critical of Piggy. "I was the only boy in our school what had asthma," said the fat boy with a touch of pride, and we might be encouraged to view this pride as misplaced. It's as though Piggy has chosen to be a bully, and it reminds us of that description of him as very fat, as though perhaps Piggy takes pride in his fatness. We begin to question his personal hygiene. The windbreaker is grubby, and then he smeared the sweat from his cheeks and quickly adjusted the spectacles on his nose. We picture him dripping with sweat, which is caused by his fatness, and this is a fatness that we've begun to blame him for. Another way to blame Piggy is symbolic. He is the first to suffer from eating them fruit, and the fruit becomes symbolic of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, the fruit from the tree of knowledge and of good and evil, and it seems that Piggy has acquired that knowledge, which has tainted him in some way. We next see him partly through Ralph's eyes as he waded away. This is slightly comic. We imagine his wide-legged stance as he tries to get to somewhere that he can evacuate his bowels without soiling his legs as he goes. And then he becomes slightly dehumanized. Going to the toilet, we hear the fat boy's grunts. So it seems that Golding has deliberately presented a character who is easy to see as a victim. Perhaps Golding is keen to show that every person is evenly balanced between good and bad, good and evil, and for this reason Piggy is never wholly a victim. Thus we see him here comparing his own body to Ralph's, and Ralph's is described as golden, not just in colour but symbolically. It's as though Ralph has been privileged and given this great body that Piggy has been denied. There's a kind of unfairness in nature. Next he presents Piggy as a better leader than Ralph. Piggy decides that they need to make a list of the boys on the island so that they can keep track of them, and he also suggests that they ought to have a meeting, things which prove vital in their early days. We also noticed that Piggy is probably used to having to persuade those who have more authority than him but less intelligence. Ralph did not take the hint. Consequently, we might infer that Piggy is used to having to give these hints to people who have more authority than him, and he is forced to continue. It's as though he doesn't like having to demonstrate his superior intelligence this way, because he's not going to get any credit for it. He also tries to build alliances. He speaks confidentially. However, Golding is clear that any kind of weakness will be exploited by the other boys, and Piggy doesn't seem to have learnt this vital, if horrible, lesson. So long as they don't call me what they used to call me at school. And this confession actually gets Ralph interested. It builds an alliance. Ralph's reaction is merely to see his weakness, chanting "Piggy, Piggy," so that Piggy is reduced to a kind of prayer. He clasps his hands in aspiration, and here he becomes representative of victims everywhere. And also perhaps Golding is suggesting that boys instinctively pick on weakness. They are instinctively drawn towards this kind of evil. Golding encourages us to feel sympathy for him. Piggy grinned reluctantly, pleased despite himself at even this much recognition. We picture him being overlooked and ignored, not just because of his fat, but also his working class dialect and his thick-rimmed glasses, the fact that he lives with his auntie, and then his asthma. You can see that Golding has layered disadvantage upon disadvantage with Piggy. A further description returns us to the envy that Piggy has about Ralph's body in comparison to his own, and it's quite interesting in a novel that appears very realistic that after some weeks on the island, Piggy never loses his fatness, and logically it should be impossible for him to stay fat given the paucity of their diet. They hardly ever get to eat pig, and the fruit seems to go straight through them, especially Piggy. But he remains fat in the eyes of the other boys. Now, perhaps this is because they can no longer see him as a normal boy, even though he must have lost weight. Golding doesn't dwell on this fact. He simply leaves it to our imagination, and perhaps makes us complicit with the boys. It's also only through Piggy that Golding gives us the exposition, the backstory of the novel. Not them. Didn't you hear what the pilot said about the atom bomb? They're all dead. It's only through listening to Piggy that we find out what has happened to bring the boys to the island, and we infer a Third World War is taking place. Interestingly, many readers in my class miss this because, like the boys, they are attuned to not listening to Piggy. They dismiss him because of his fatness, his asthma, his glasses, and his apparently ridiculous attachment to his auntie. But in case we become too sympathetic or admiring of him, Golding gives us a description which allows us to belittle him again. His lips quivered and the spectacles were dimmed with mist. This again is a sign of vulnerability. He appears, in the language of the boys, like a crybaby, and we're able to dismiss him again. Consequently, his observation, "we may stay here till we die," is more a cry of self-pity. However, Golding is also using it as a way of foreshadowing what's to come, because many of them will die. In actual fact, Piggy will be killed on the island, but metaphorically, how many of them have been drawn into the ways of war by their experience here? How many of them will die in the future because of the savagery that the island has unleashed in them? Piggy's status as a victim is highlighted when Ralph announces to everyone that "he's not Fatty," cried Ralph, "his real name's Piggy." And interestingly, Golding refuses to give us Piggy's real name after that. It's as though Ralph has dictated what he shall be known as, and he's always called Piggy. We never discover his real name. Perhaps this is Golding's way of pointing out the final injustice. which is that of the class system, which excludes someone that is not of the same class as the other boys. This is emphasised in Piggy's manner. He bowed his head as though deferring to those of a higher class. Interestingly, the boys close ranks against him here in a closed circuit of sympathy, which echoes the circuit and the circle they will all get into when they kill Simon later. Finally, there's the symbolism of his glasses. Piggy cleaned his glasses, and there is a sense that Golding is playing with this image of the person who has the least vision actually being able to see best, and the glasses symbolise this. Piggy can see things that the other characters don't. We remember that the chapter is called The Sound of the Shell, and him with the shell is elected leader, and the shell itself, the conch, comes to represent democracy. But all this comes from Piggy. It's Piggy's idea to use the shell to call an assembly. It's Piggy's idea to have a meeting and get things sorted. Piggy is the driving force that could save them on the island, but he becomes increasingly ignored. And Golding is perhaps suggesting that the prejudice of the other boys might lead to the unfolding tragedy. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Piggy in this chapter is that he is clearly the most intelligent of all the characters, and yet he's dismissed as a leader. He doesn't even enter into the vote. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy. It must have been interesting for Golding as a teacher to decide that the person with the most intelligence, and therefore the one who's likely to have the best ideas about rescue and how they should look after each other on the island, is the one who is most ignored. Perhaps Golding is attacking the very idea of leadership and government and how things operate in a society that is supposed to be a meritocracy. A meritocracy is where people rise through any kind of hierarchy or rank according to their ability, and yet here Piggy, who is the most able, is the least likely to succeed. It may be that Golding is also criticising his British society for being organised in this way. Despite Piggy's betrayal by Ralph, he still decides that he will vote for Ralph as a leader. It's reluctant. Then Piggy too raised his hand grudgingly into the air. But he can see beyond people's cruelty, also to their capacity for goodness. And it's this moment, perhaps, that we realise that Ralph is a much better person than Jack, because Piggy has realised this, and we come to see the boys through Piggy's eyes. It's important to remember that a writer is not creating real characters here. They are constructs, constructed to give the author's ideas. And here, the author's idea is to present a victim that we can sympathise with, but also partly reject. We partly victimise him ourselves. It's Piggy's humiliation that is focused on here, because it allows Ralph a moment of insight. He saw that Piggy was hurt and crushed, and it allows Ralph to make the choice to help Piggy rather than crush him further. And it gives us a way forward. Those of us who are kind to victims will defeat our inner urge towards evil. And this is part of Golding's moral message in the novel. Another way of looking at Piggy is as a mother figure. We have seen him caring for the other boys as they arrive at the assembly, taking their names, looking after them, helping them up onto the platform. And here the description of Piggy becomes almost feminine. Piggy stood, and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. And this idea of the rose in the cheeks is quite a feminine description. We will see later in the novel that all things feminine are attacked, and Golding could be using this feminine view of Piggy to bring out the boys' inherent sexism, the attack on anything that isn't like themselves.